by 2020. The second change which is now taking place, and this is my earnest request to all our students, the world is becoming very harsh. This harshness almost borders on cruelty. There was a time when there was enough space even for mediocrity in society. Today, competition has toughened. Whether it's industry or it's services or it's professions or it's management. And because competition has toughened a lot, those who emerge out of the system, mediocrity would be almost close to frustrating failures. You may not be dumb, but you'll be in the crowd and difficult. They've risen. And I repeat that the space for mediocrity is narrowing down. It's contracting. And therefore, you have to try to get onto that fast track, and these are the 4, 5, 6 years of your life which will determine which track you are on. It's a bad sign that they do. But once you get onto the fast track, it's immaterial what the financial resources, what the background, what the caste, what the religiosity of your family was. Your ability to reach the top will always be there because there's always space on top. Where the age of grey eminence is over. Your hair don't have to turn grey. Become editors of newspapers when you are in your 30s. You don't have to wait for 55 and 60 to do that. The age of eminence is different. It may be wrong to even call ourselves a developing society at that time. We are today. They were meant to be very fast track. Because at that time, the primary challenge before the country, the second challenge was that was an age where democracies were tumbling world over. Monarchies were being created, dictatorships were being created, military juntas used to take over. At one stage, almost 2/3 of the world was being ruled, or communist dictatorships were there. Barring that brief period of the mid-70s, the emergency, it goes to the credit of India that we managed to keep the country secure, we managed to prop up our debt. So the reversal of that process has now been turned as reforms. Economy, once it grows and grows at a faster rate, will it have a great trickle-down effect? And the poor will benefit automatically? A number of people say no, it will never happen. I think the truth is somewhere in the grey area. The trickle-down effect does take place. It is not a complete answer. Any area where institutions have come up, where factories have come up in the rural areas, people get jobs. Housing, today it's expanding beyond cities, getting into rural areas. People are moving from the kind of unacceptable housing that they were living in into better housing, though a large part of India still needs it. So the slow trickle-down effect takes place. Telecom, each one of us had to wait 20 years before getting a phone, so it's trickling down now. It does take place, but it's not a complete answer. The economic model which is now becoming broadly an acceptable model in India is, you need investment in India, you need larger economic activity in India, you need a higher growth rate. Profit is not a bad word. If there is no profit, nobody will invest. People will go outside where there is greater profitability, they'll invest there. And if they earn profit, they'll pay revenue to the state. They'll create jobs. If they don't earn profit, they'll close down and lose jobs. And if a state has greater revenue in its pockets become deeper. So along with the trickle-down effect, the state takes money out of its own deep pockets and then starts the poverty alleviation. And for the kind of poverty alleviation programs that we need in this country, you need almost a double-digit growth rate. So there is no conflict between poverty alleviation and hastening the growth rates. So you take all the necessary steps required to hasten the growth rates. You equally require steps which empower the state financially in order to run the poverty alleviation scheme. So a combination of the trickle-down effect and the special measures for the weaker sections is a combination, and I think barring friendship thought, we are broadly moving in that direction. You need a huge amount of industrialization in this country. Your manufacturing sector must grow. One of the great factors which enabled China's growth was that its manufacturing growth curve was 12 and 14 and 15%. Unless your growth curve goes into that direction, that's where jobs are created, mass jobs are created. That's where people, 60% people in the agriculture, at least 20 to 30% will leave agriculture, leaving the rest to run agriculture and get into the manufacturing sector. Therefore, if you go to states which have grown faster, which are more industrialized states, you'll see this process slowly taking place. Now, that's where you need to banish poverty, create employment opportunities, make India almost a land of opportunities, which is extremely necessary. Now you have, along with this, the problem of inequality, so you have to respect the human being. You have to create a mechanism where standards of life, quality of life, which employment provides to you. Structured employment in India is only available with 18% people. 51% are self-employed in agriculture, retail, and other professions. 30% are almost unemployed or underemployed. Therefore, you need India, the inequalities of these areas to come up and get into a state where you need to fight these inequalities. Now, having said that, I think one of the great challenges before India is going to be, we have two huge challenges which require to be fought in this process. And this is what countries, the developed countries in the West, these are the challenges they've not faced. We have serious issues of security as far as India is concerned. Even though I started by saying that the threats to unity and sovereignty are over, and therefore we have to think in terms of growth. Along with growth, you have regions which have developed aspirations, and therefore there is a transformation of the central issue in Indian public life. So unity and sovereignty has been replaced by federal desires. So you actually see federalism in action. Coalition governments are a product of federalism. You find regions which are complaining that we are underemployed, we are underdeveloped. If you actually draw a line midway through India, which passes through the city of Kanpur, you'll actually find a lot of developmental activity taking place on the west of that line. Almost to the east of that line, the developmental activity is significantly less. And that is perhaps an answer to the question, one of our biggest challenges of the Maoist problem has emerged. Now, Maoists are no social reformers. They want to overthrow India's parliamentary democracy and replace it with a communistic pattern of the state. They have no qualms about using violence to do that. They attack police parties, seize arms. The enemy's armory is our arm. I recently read some of their literature, some of their websites carry that. The enemy's armory is our armory. This is what Mao used to say. That's what they follow. But because our development in some of the tribal regions has been inadequate, so you have this whole corridor from the Nepal border right till Telangana. So we are faced with the question how to fight this. Do you only use the military method or do you use an alternate method? Now the real truth is again somewhere in between. It's very easy to say please go in for development. But then to build a school there, to build a welfare center there, to build a road there, the collector and the public works department has to enter there. You can't physically enter as long as the landmines are there. No contractor will work in an environment of extortionism. And therefore you need to take away the violence out of that system. So you will need the police and the military might of the state. You will also need to spend a huge part of our resource on those citizens. It's only on all those regions. It's only a combination of both that will enable us really to reach a situation where we can fight this great menace which is standing in way of our development. The Kashmir issue. Are we aware of how much it has cost us in the last 65 years? I won't go into the details of the issue. Though I feel it's a problem which we created ourselves 65 years ago. But without going into the possible answers to this, Pakistan has never reconciled to Kashmir being a part of India. It tried direct wars, it lost. It tried a proxy war through terror, cross-border terror. It then realized that the might of the Indian state can now fight terror. The world does not accept after 9/11 particularly the profits and benefits of terror. It doesn't allow you to eat up the rewards of terror. Now they're trying other techniques, the stone movement, the stone throwing movement. And it's not a movement, somebody stole the stone, it's an innocuous gesture. You have a crowd of 5,000 people attacking a picket of 5 policemen or military men with 5 stones each. It's as good as using a machine gun. And then you'll say, oh, we were only throwing stones and you were violent on us. And I think India's answer lies in alienating the separatist groups and winning over the people of Kashmir. We must make sure, because once you create a security environment in a state, well-meaning people also get harassed. When I visited the Kashmir Valley as a part of several parliamentary delegations, the best response to me came from students from the Kashmir University. One young lady got up and told the Home Minister, I was sitting next to him, well, I have no difficulty, I am completely an Indian. But when I go to my college, I don't want to be harassed 5 times by the policeman. So the separatists want a Kashmir which is always burning. That's their playfield. In a peaceful Kashmir, they are like fish out of water. They become only Friday evening speakers at religious functions. That's what happened in the past, that's what's happening these days. Fortunately, there's an improved situation. And I think these are all areas which have cost us. So there is one area of national development in terms of unity and integrity and these 2 major threats. There is a second area. And that area is very worrisome to me. And that area is very worrisome to me. I do remember when people ask me, where do you think the biggest threat to Indian democracy comes from? When people ask me, where does the threat to Indian democracy and Indian system come from? Does it come from the security threats? Does it come from the security threats to India, from Maoist forces, from cross-border terrorism? I think we are strong enough. These are challenges, but we can fight them. Does it come from lack of economic development and frustration caused by poverty? It takes some time to build nation states. And I think if we follow the correct economic model over the years to come, we can substantially reduce our poverty figures. But I think the main threat will always come from an environment of cynicism, and the Prime Minister 2 days ago commented on it, which starts building up when you see poor quality of governance. It's then that people start getting disillusioned with the system. It's then that some element of negativism builds up. And I responded to that by an article yesterday where I said, the correct question to be asked is, why does negativism build up? And the answer is, it's only when we in governance fail the people. You give a great quality of governance, there is a great enthusiasm amongst people. But if people see inadequate governance in a country, and that's linked to your second subject of accountability, then comes a question, well, is this the right system? People start questioning the relevance of the system and its possible sustainability itself. Now, this is where the Indian governance and those involved in the polity of India have to realize. Let me tell you a challenge. The challenge is the power of politics is immense. There is no substitute for politics. Politics influences the life of a nation. Politics determines policy. Politics finds its representation in parliament and state legislatures. And the power of politics is huge. It determines the direction a nation takes. So there is a logical expectation that in view of this power of politics, the stature and quality of men who man this polity must bear nexus to the power they wield. And I think that is where people get a sense of cynicism, when we find that the stature of those men doesn't measure up to the job and the responsibility that they have. And that is when we come to the question, how do we fix political accountability? Mr. Gupta, in his opening comments, raised a question that there is a recent issue of allocation of natural resources. Now, the big debate was, how do we allocate natural resources? Do we do it by a discretion? Do we do it by a transparent process? I've always been very clear in my mind. In India, where you have discretions, you will have more abuse of power than use of power. Therefore, one straightaway answer is, please eliminate discretions. Go back to the system of merit. Go back to an objective criteria where we are ruled by rules and not ruled by men. Therefore, you may have exceptional cases, and I think the Supreme Court in the reference opinion returned a very mature verdict where the Supreme Court said, if you are allocating a natural resource meant for commercial exploitation, so the wealth of the citizen, the wealth of the people, the wealth of the state gets transferred into private hands. And this is meant for commercial exploitation. So spectrum was not meant for charity, it was meant for commercial exploitation. Coal is not meant for charity, it is meant for commercial exploitation. So when it is meant for commercial exploitation, there must be a transparent and competitive bidding. So those who pay the state the maximum by a transparent process are the people who get it. The second object is, you don't transfer wealth of the state to the private citizen for a song. You charge what is the market quality. The market value is determined by the market itself. It can't be determined by somebody sitting in a mantralaya. Because again, you are bound to earn and there will be allegations. Therefore, the simple rule is, if a natural resource is meant for commercial exploitation and the resource of the state is being transferred to a person or a company for commercial exploitation, maximization of profit of the state, maximizing of the value, as also a competitive bidding, a transparent process must follow. There can be exceptions. And the exceptions can only be, there can be natural resources you need for livelihood. Water and air can't be auctioned. So that's an exception. That's a natural resource, can't be auctioned. But the spectrum in that air can be auctioned. The gas below the water in a sea can be auctioned. The petroleum below that, the crude oil below that can be auctioned. The only other exception they've said is that if something is intended to be given for a social or welfare object. Now here the social welfare objects have to be very clearly defined. your own professional educational institutions, you'll have to pay the institutional rates. One of the judges has made a very interesting comment. He says they can be given cheaply, provided they are linked to the charges these institutions charge. So if the hospital is charging a huge amount, then perhaps it's not entitled to get land at a cheaper rate. Then he must pay what you charge your patient, so you must pay the state for your land. However, if you can say that I'll cap it, and that's a part of the agreement, that gives me an exception. My only fear in breaching this rule of bidding and market value is linked to my first premise that we still need to improve the quality of people in governance. We need to improve their integrity levels and their accountability levels. And in a country like India, if you give the discretion to the state to deviate from the rule of competitive bidding and determine it on a case-to-case basis, then in all likelihood, the case-to-case basis, I said this in writing in an article, transforms itself into a suitcase-to-suitcase basis. And that opens the floodgates. Therefore, that is what requires to be prevented in a society like India. The second problem, there is a sudden decline, I find, in the last 2 decades in the nature and character of political parties in India. And this has direct relationship to the issue of accountability. We've seen the American system. Both the principal political parties had the primaries. There's a democratic system within the party by which you elect and decide who your leader will be for the presidential race. You've seen the drill that they are going through in the 3 national debates. And somebody lagging behind can just come up because he puts a better performance. So it's following the survival of the fittest rule. That's how democracies are run. In England, I remember about 2 years ago when Mr. David Cameron's Conservative Party took over, I was in London and I was speaking to some of the Labour MPs and I said, what are you doing? He says, for 6 months after losing the election, we are all locked ourselves up and we are in an inner party process. It will take us 6 months to determine who our next leader will be. So there are party conferences, there are discussions, etc. Now what happened unfortunately in India in the last 2 decades, that there are only few structured parties left. And I blame all of us sitting here. The left parties are a structured party. My party to a large extent is a structured party. Most other political parties have transformed. They are controlled by a family. They are controlled by a person. The person normally is charismatic. He has the support of a caste or a group or a community behind him. He eliminates all opposition within the party. And succession is on basis of what happens within the family. You will then find, and if you now look at the map of India, there are 2 principal parties in the Kashmir Valley. Punjab, Haryana, UP, not Nitish Kumar, but it's a more structured party, but the earlier government which ruled there for 15 years. Not the left. Then you come down. The principal party in India is the crowd around the family. You go to Maharashtra, you go to Andhra Pradesh, you go to Tamil Nadu. So barring a few cases left, you can count them on one hand, on 5 fingers. So you now have parties led by charismatic people, they have a community support, there's a family control, all accounts remain within the family, the succession remains within the family. And we now have a complete replacement of meritocracy in India. Nobody knew of President Obama 2 years before he was elected. He made his impact in the campaign. And now the impact is that once you have this entire system, and unfortunately Indian mindsets have to change. They have to get out of this feudal cycle. The real strength of Indian democracy will emerge when merit replaces surnames. That's what I told you in the very beginning, and that's what I'm reiterating even in politics. It's happened in business. Those legendary families we used to name in the 60s or the 70s have been now overtaken. Who had heard of these Bangalore IT companies 20 years ago? Now this has to happen. And therefore, if we are a young, popular country, if we are a country which is seeking to enlarge a human resource, we have to improve the quality of polity. Now the other danger is that if you have a captive support, then even corruption allegations can't take you. UP is a living example. You have the two big parties in Uttar Pradesh, both facing similar allegations. One replaces the other and continues to be on the same track. They hold the balance of power at the center. And therefore, and you'll find this directly impinging on the quality of governance in UP. Bihar managed to emerge slightly out of this, and you can see visible changes taking place. And I think therefore it's necessary now, it's for the people of India to realize. I always believe there's a very important quotation from a very well-known judge called Justice Learned Hand. He said, democracy lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law can save it. And therefore, people of India have to realize how long do we go by this feudal psyche of eulogizing surnames and families rather than merit and quality. And unless we introduce that merit and quality into Indian politics, the norms of accountability will remain farcical. Now, if you come down to the next step, you need mechanisms in a society. Nobody in the United States thinks in terms of they have transparent political funding mechanisms. We don't. How Indian politics sustains is itself a question. I, of course, know the answer, but there is always a conspiracy of silence. We don't share that answer with people. If that's the plight of the world's largest democracy, then let's not have seminars on accountability, let's implement it. When I was the law minister, I introduced 2 changes in law, that corporates and individuals can now donate by check. And whatever they give by check, they'll get an income tax exemption. So we try to incentivize it.